Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever felt stuck in a loop, constantly putting out fires, instead of truly shaping your future? Or maybe strategic thinking feels like one of those buzzwords everyone uses, but few can actually define, let alone teach you how to do it. Today, we're diving deep into exactly that. We're going to pull back the curtain on strategic thinking, not just what it is, but how it actually works in your brain, why it's so often misunderstood, and most importantly, how you can build this critical capability for yourself and your organization.
That's absolutely the mission for this deep dive. We've synthesized insights from, well, a really rich body of sources from the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies to military command centers and the cutting edge of cognitive psychology.
Right.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to mastering the mental game required to navigate our increasingly complex and uncertain world.
So let's begin at the beginning then. Strategic thinking often gets blurred, doesn't it, with terms like strategic planning or even operational management. Why is it so crucial to draw a clear line between these concepts?
Well, it's far more than just picking the right words, you know?
Yeah.
This confusion actually points to a fundamental misunderstanding of the unique cognitive processes involved.
Okay.
Organizations that fail to differentiate them risk creating real dysfunction, like trying to plan their way into a novel strategy, which can actually stifle the very creativity they're hoping to cultivate.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So, for our deep dive today, what's the precise definition of true strategic thinking we're working with?
Okay. At its core, strategic thinking is a future-oriented cognitive process that designs pathways to create sustained value or competitive advantage.
Right.
It's about being intent-driven, shaping your purpose, and proactively aligning your organization's future with its anticipated environment. Crucially, it's not about producing a detailed step-by-step plan.
Not the plan itself.
No, instead it's about enabling sound judgment and developing truly innovative strategies.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. It's not just thinking about the future in a linear way. The sources describe a fascinating duality at play. Tell us about that.
Indeed. Yeah, strategic thinking beautifully combines a rational, convergent approach with a creative, divergent thought process. Henry Mintzberg, who's, a seminal voice in this field, famously argued that strategic thinking is primarily about synthesis.
Synthesis.
Yes, involving deep intuition and raw creativity. The outcome isn't a rigid blueprint, but what he called an integrated perspective of the enterprise, a not too precisely articulated vision of direction.
A vision, not a map.
Exactly. Think of this vision as your North Star, providing the guiding light for all subsequent actions, but without dictating every single step.
And what kind of problems is this specific mode of thinking best suited to solve? What's it for?
It's designed for the problems that are complex, unfamiliar, uncertain, and ambiguous, those situations where existing logic or a simple algorithm just won't cut it.
The really tricky ones.
The really tricky ones. It's the mental toolkit you absolutely need when, as one source put it, the usual way of thinking today will almost certainly be ineffective in the near future.
Okay, to bring it all together, the sources provide a comprehensive definition for you, the listener. Let me read this out, it's important. The ability to generate and apply unique business insights and opportunities intended to create a competitive advantage for a firm or organization. Quote, it involves a future-oriented, holistic, and systematic cognitive process that combines creative and divergent thinking to envision potential futures with rational and convergent thinking to assess pathways to achieving them. Its ultimate purpose is to facilitate sound judgment in navigating complex and uncertain environments to achieve sustained success. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, but that clarity is absolutely crucial, isn't it?
It is, absolutely, because it immediately sets strategic thinking apart from other activities. And the biggest source of confusion, as you highlighted, is with strategic planning.
Right, so let's break that down. Why is strategic planning not strategic thinking, as Mintzberg famously asserted?
Okay. Strategic thinking is the generative, creative, and intuitive process that precedes formal planning. It's often called the art of strategy, focused on synthesis, discovery, and conceiving a novel vision. It's a divergent process, meaning it opens up possibilities.
Opens things up.
Exactly. Strategic planning, in contrast, is the formal, analytical, and systematic process that takes place after a strategy has been conceived. This is the science of strategy, focused on analysis, breaking down the vision, and articulating it into concrete plans with timelines and metrics. It's a convergent process.
So it narrows things down.
It narrows possibilities down.
So if strategic thinking provides the what and why, then planning gives us the how and when. That distinction feels really important.
Precisely. Planning acts as a powerful catalyst for thought and a mechanism for programming a strategy that's already been created, but it simply cannot create the strategy itself.
It can't generate the idea.
Right. Critics noted that organizations that over-relied on planning often ended up with merely thick planning books and five-year financial projections increasingly viewed as irrelevant.
Heard that one before.
Yeah. Why? Because they were trying to use an analytical tool for a creative outcome, leading to an extrapolation of the present rather than the invention of the future.
Okay. Beyond planning, there's also operational thinking. How do we distinguish that from strategic thinking, and why does that matter for leaders?
Right. Operational thinking applies known logic to solve familiar problems within a defined environment. It's what you use for routine activities like executing a marketing campaign effectively or optimizing a supply chain, things you know how to do.
Day-to-day stuff.
Exactly. Strategic thinking, however, is for unfamiliar, complex, uncertain problems where there's no pre-existing algorithm for a solution. It operates at the macro level, focused on the long-term viability of the entire enterprise. It's about designing the campaign itself or maybe rethinking the supply chain entirely.
That makes so much sense. It explains that common organizational challenge where brilliant operational thinkers get promoted but then struggle to anticipate and shape the future of the business, doesn't it?
Precisely. Each mode addresses a different core question, operates on a different time horizon, and requires a distinct set of cognitive skills. With strategic thinking, you're asking, what could we be? Long-term, future-shaping focus, using synthesis and creativity for unfamiliar challenges. For strategic planning, it's how do we get there? Mid to long-term, programming the future with analysis and logic for complicated problems. Operational thinking asks, how do we solve this immediate problem? Present-focused, managing the present through application and execution for familiar situations. Recognizing which mode is needed is truly the first step toward effective leadership.
Okay, now that we have a clear map of what strategic thinking is and isn't, let's pull back the curtain even further. How does this kind of thinking actually happen inside our brains? What's going on up there?
Right. Well, strategic thought emerges from a dynamic interplay of three core cognitive components: a robust knowledge base, a flexible problem representation, and powerful inference processes.
Oh.
Think of them as forming a recursive system, like a continuous feedback loop of perception, interpretation, and constant adaptation.
Let's start with the knowledge base. This sounds like the raw material, the stuff you know.
It absolutely is. It's the totality of information a decision maker possesses, not just facts and figures, but personal experiences, deeply held beliefs about how things work, and procedural knowledge. Different inputs here will inevitably yield different strategic outputs.
Makes sense.
Crucially, this isn't just a flat list of data points. It's a hierarchically organized network of concepts, nodes, connected by a complex web of relations or links. A truly new insight often means forming a previously unmade connection between two existing concepts in that network.
So it's like suddenly connecting the dots between, say, emerging market growth and maybe a niche political risk or a subtle shift you noticed in consumer demographics.
Exactly that. And a powerful way our brains organize this knowledge is through schemata, sometimes called scripts. Imagine a seasoned CEO walking into a new market. They don't just see a jumble of facts. Their brain instantly pulls up schemata mental blueprints from past experiences.
Make mental models.
Kind of, yeah. It's like having a mental playbook for different scenarios. A market entry schema might tell them, okay, in this kind of situation, these 5 things are usually critical, and these 3 behaviors are typical for competitors. It's how experts quickly interpret ambiguous information and anticipate what comes next. Though the trick is knowing when your old playbook doesn't apply to a truly novel situation.
Right, when to update the schema. Okay, next up is problem representation, which the source is called the art of framing. Why is that framing so critical?
It's the process of perceiving and defining the problem itself, essentially creating a mental conceptualization of goals, constraints, and available options. The way a problem is set up or framed profoundly impacts the solutions that ultimately emerge.
How you see it determines how you solve it.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating that experts, unlike novices, dedicate far more time to problem representation. They're trying to understand the deep structures of an issue rather than just its superficial features.
And this directly ties into the framing effect, which is genuinely mind-bending when you think about it.
It really is, yeah.
Aye.
Logically identical problems, when presented differently, can lead decision makers to represent them in opposite ways and arrive at contradictory solutions. Think about a business option framed as, gaining 20% market share, versus the exact same option framed as a project with an 80% chance of not failing.
Feels different, even if it's the same outcome.
It feels very different. Even if the expected values are identical, your perception and willingness to take action will likely change. This highlights that problem representation is inherently subjective. Each manager brings their unique knowledge and biases, leading to different frames and often, real conflict within teams because they're literally seeing the problem differently.
Okay. Finally, inference processes connect the knowledge base and problem representation. What exactly do these processes do for a strategist? How do they work?
Well, they allow the strategist to reason, abstract, and project into the future, to go beyond the information given, especially when faced with incomplete knowledge, which is almost always the case in strategy.
Right, you never have all the facts.
Never. Two primary forms are central here. First, gap filling. This is about making inferences to fill in missing information because it's too costly to acquire, maybe it's deliberately concealed, or you simply haven't yet recognized it as relevant. You infer what facts must be based on your accumulated world knowledge and your existing schemata. Second, extrapolation. This is projecting current knowledge, concepts, and meanings abstracted from the past and present into predictions for the future. And this is a profoundly difficult cognitive task, essentially applying concepts from a known world to an unknown one.
And one of the most powerful inference mechanisms mentioned is reasoning by analogy. Feels like a kind of superpower for strategists.
Absolutely, I think it is. It's about mapping knowledge from a familiar source, maybe a past project, a historical event, even a completely different industry, to a current unfamiliar target problem.
Seeing patterns across domains.
Exactly. By identifying deep structural similarities, a strategist can transfer useful wisdom and potential solutions, often bypassing the need to build a strategy completely from scratch. It's how we apply old lessons to new situations and perceive those abstract strategic similarities despite vast superficial differences.
So it's this continuous iterative feedback loop between the knowledge base, the problem representation, and these inference processes that allows the strategist to adapt their mental model to a constantly changing world. That really sounds like the engine of strategic insight, doesn't it?
That's a perfect way to describe it. It's the engine.
Okay, so if the last section was about the hardware of the strategic mind, how it's built, let's talk about the software, the specific cognitive skills effective strategists consistently deploy. What are the key ones?
Right. Our sources point to 4 foundational skills that repeatedly emerge as critical. These are the tools in the toolkit, if you will.
First up, systems thinking. This sounds like seeing the entire landscape, not just individual trees, right?
That's a perfect way to put it. It is arguably the most fundamental skill. It's the ability to see the world not as fragmented, isolated parts, but as a holistic system of interconnected elements.
Seeing the connections.
Precisely. Rather than focusing on a single isolated problem, the systems thinker examines how components interact, looking for underlying structures, patterns, and forces that shape behavior over time. It helps you see how changes in one part create unintended consequences elsewhere through feedback loops.
The ripple effects.
Exactly, the ripple effects. And crucially, to identify leverage points, those places where small, targeted actions can yield surprisingly significant improvements. This prevents leaders from getting overwhelmed and allows them to anticipate those second and third order effects.
Next, creative cognition. Generating novelty. This sounds like the truly exciting part of strategy where the new ideas come from.
It is essential, yeah.
Yeah.
Creativity in strategy isn't about unconstrained artistic expression. It's the disciplined production of ideas that are both novel and genuinely useful in a competitive environment.
Novel and useful. Key distinction.
Very key. It's about finding genuinely new approaches that create a decisive advantage. The modern view sees it as applying familiar cognitive processes to existing knowledge, retrieving information in new ways, forming unexpected conceptual combinations, and, as we discussed, crucially using analogical reasoning. It involves a dynamic interplay, divergent thinking to brainstorm a wide variety of alternatives without immediate judgment.
Going wide.
Going wide, exactly. Followed by synthesis to combine disparate ideas into a new, coherent whole. This capacity is truly what distinguishes a visionary strategist from someone who merely optimizes existing processes.
And then we have cognitive reflection. The discipline of deliberation. This sounds like a crucial meta skill, almost like hitting the pause button before you leap.
It absolutely is a meta skill. Strategic environments are inherently ambiguous, right? They often trigger fast, intuitive gut responses. And while intuition can be powerful and sometimes necessary,
Sort of gut feelings matter.
they do, but they can also lead us astray. Cognitive reflection is the crucial ability to resist reporting the first response that comes to mind and instead engage in more effortful, deliberative analysis. It's best understood through dual system theory. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive. System 2 is slow, analytical, deliberate.
Thinking fast and slow.
Exactly. High cognitive reflection means you actively monitor your System 1 intuitions, you detect potential errors, and you consciously decide when to rely on that gut feeling versus engaging in more rigorous System 2 analytical thought. It's paramount for questioning your own initial judgments.
Finally, cognitive reframing. The power of perspective. I imagine this is vital for breaking free from old mental models or habits, getting unstuck.
Precisely. It's the conscious ability to shift your perspective and examine a situation from multiple viewpoints. It's the perfect antidote to rigidity of view, that feeling of being stuck in one way of seeing things. And it's a powerful way to break free from traditional approaches, leading to genuinely innovative solutions.
How do you do it?
Well, at its heart, reframing involves actively identifying and challenging the underlying assumptions and interpretations of your current frame on a problem. Techniques include perspective taking, literally trying to view the situation through the eyes of competitors, customers, maybe even regulators; evidence-based reframing, rigorously examining the evidence for and against your existing beliefs; and Socratic questioning, asking tough questions like, what is the evidence for this belief? What is an alternative explanation? Mastering this helps you arrive at more balanced, nuanced judgments.
It's remarkable how these four skills don't just stand alone. They really seem to work together, dynamically.
Yeah, they're deeply synergistic. They create a powerful strategic toolkit. Systems thinking gives you the holistic map, helping you see the entire interconnected landscape. Creativity then allows you to generate novel paths on that map. Reframing provides the power to redraw the map entirely when it's become obsolete or misleading. And cognitive reflection is the master meta-skill, allowing you to pause, question your initial intuition, and consciously choose to deploy the right tool at the right time.
So you need all four working together.
Ideally, yes. Effective strategists deploy them in a coordinated, disciplined, and highly adaptive fashion.
Okay, so we've covered what strategic thinking is and the essential skills involved.
Yeah.
But how does it all unfold dynamically when you're actually doing it? Especially in fast-moving competitive situations. Are there models for that?
Yes, absolutely. Researchers have developed some pretty sophisticated process models that illustrate this dynamic. 3 prominent ones provide unique lenses: the cognitive hierarchy model, the analogical emergence of choice model, and the divergent convergent cycle.
Let's start with iterative reasoning. The cognitive hierarchy, CH, and leveled lick models. This sounds complex, like trying to get inside your opponent's head.
That's a great way to put it, actually. These models, they come from behavioral game theory, and they describe strategic thinking in interactive situations as a process of limited, iterative reasoning about the reasoning of other players.
Thinking about what they're thinking.
Exactly. But unlike classical game theory that often assumes perfect rationality, these are built on the more realistic assumption of bounded rationality, which simply means our brains have limits, right? We have finite cognitive resources.
We can't think infinitely deep.
Precisely. The core idea is a hierarchy of player types or levels based on their depth of strategic thought. A level 0 player is non-strategic, maybe they just choose a simple heuristic. A level 1 player assumes everyone else is level 0 and figures out the best response to that. A level player best responds to what they believe a level K1 player would do.
So it's layers of thinking.
Layers of thinking. The more refined cognitive hierarchy model assumes an LK player believes the world is populated by a distribution of all lower-level types, and they calculate the best response to that mix. These models are remarkably successful at explaining why real-world behavior often deviates from those perfect rationality predictions. They give us a formal framework for understanding how strategists with limited capacity reason about their opponents in a dynamic marketplace. It's like thinking about what they think you think they think, but knowing most people stop after 1 or 2 steps.
Fascinating. That's incredibly practical for competitive business environments. What about analogical reasoning? The emergence of choice, Capablanca model.
Right. This model, embodied in a computational architecture called Capablanca, addresses how deep understanding and strategic choice arise in truly novel, complex, and ill-structured domains. Think like playing chess at a master level or navigating a really ambiguous market disruption.
Where there's no clear playbook.
Exactly. It posits that strategic insight doesn't come from exhaustive calculation, like a computer brute forcing moves, but from a powerful process of making analogies to past experiences. It builds the problem representation incrementally through dynamic, multi-leveled interpretation. Starts with low-level concrete perception, like identifying individual products in a market, moves to mid-level relational structuring, identifying attack or defense relationships between companies, maybe with intensity, and finally, high-level abstract roles, where these relationships coalesce, turning a competitor into a market disruptor or a product line into a protective moat.
So it builds understanding layer by layer through comparison.
Precisely. Reasoning at this abstract level enables the perception of deep strategic similarity between situations that look superficially very different. This allows the strategist to instantly recall relevant knowledge from past analogies and avoid getting bogged down in endless calculations.
And the third model is the divergent convergent cycle, the rhythm of innovation.
Yes, this model, which is central to the U.S. Army War College framework, describes strategic thinking as an iterative cycle between two distinct cognitive modes, divergent and convergent thinking.
We touched on this with creativity.
We did. So divergence is the exploratory phase. You generate a wide array of innovative ideas, hypotheses, possibilities. It requires temporarily suspending critical judgment, just getting ideas out there. Think brainstorming on steroids. Convergence is the evaluative phase. Here, you rigorously analyze data, critically assess those options, vet the ideas, and select the most promising ones.
Explain, then focus.
Exactly. An accomplished strategic thinker moves fluidly and rapidly between these two modes. Insights from the critical analysis fuel new creative exploration, and then those novel ideas become subjects for further evaluation. This iterative cycle helps create strategies that are both innovative and incredibly well-grounded.
So you can really see these aren't competing theories, but more like complementary tools in a strategist's arsenal, right?
Right.
A leader might use analogy to frame a new problem. Then iterative reasoning to war game opponent reactions, maybe. And finally, a divergent convergent cycle to generate and refine options for their own move.
Absolutely. That's a great synthesis. Each model provides a unique lens, enhancing the strategist's ability to navigate and shape their environment. They provide structured ways to approach the inherent messiness of real-world strategic challenges.
Okay. Our brains are amazing, capable of incredible strategic feats, but, well, they also have some predictable quirks that can trip us up, can't they? What are the common cognitive barriers that can derail even the best strategic thinking?
That's right. The human mind isn't a flawless supercomputer, and strategic thinking is often impeded by these predictable systematic errors in judgment known as cognitive biases.
The famous biases.
Exactly. These are mental shortcuts that, while incredibly useful for making fast decisions in simple environments, can lead to catastrophic failures in complex, high-stakes strategic problems. They generally fall into two broad categories: biases in how we process information, and biases driven by our emotions and motivations.
Let's start with the information processing biases, the flaws in how our minds handle raw data. What are the big ones there?
Okay, first, anchoring bias. This is the pervasive tendency to rely way too heavily on the very first piece of information received, the anchor.
That first number just sticks, doesn't it?
It really does. Subsequent information is then adjusted from this initial point, but often not enough. For example, an initial budget forecast, even if it's just a rough guess, or a competitor's opening negotiation offer, can powerfully skew your entire decision process. It effectively corrupts your strategic knowledge base right from the start.
Okay. Well,
Confirmation bias. This is a big one. It's the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses.
the echo chamber effect.
Exactly. Strategists suffering from this unconsciously seek out data that proves their chosen action is correct, while conveniently ignoring or downplaying any contradictory evidence. It creates a dangerous intellectual echo chamber, preventing you from challenging core assumptions, even when the market might be screaming otherwise.
And the third.
The framing effect. As we touched on earlier, decisions are influenced more by how information is presented than by the objective facts themselves. An initiative framed as gaining 20% market share is perceived very differently than the exact same initiative framed as a project with an 80% chance of not failing. Your very problem representation is highly susceptible to subtle manipulation, sometimes unintentional, sometimes not.
Okay. And then there are the emotional and motivational biases where our ego, our fears, and our feelings get in the way of clear thinking.
Right. These can be just as damaging, if not more so. First, overconfidence bias. This is the tendency to overestimate one's own knowledge, abilities, and the precision of the information one possesses.
Thinking you know more than you do.
Precisely. Overconfident leaders might underestimate critical risks, under-diversify their strategic bets, or too easily dismiss emerging competitors. It often masquerades as decisive leadership, but it fundamentally flaws the inference process by promoting unrealistic optimism and a dangerous belief in predicting the unpredictable. Loss aversion and status quo bias. This is a powerful psychological finding. The pain of losing something is roughly twice as powerful psychologically as the pleasure of gaining an equivalent amount.
Losing hurts more than winning feels good?
Much more. This leads to a strong aversion to taking risks, even strategically sound ones that have a positive expected value. And it directly fuels the status quo bias, which is an irrational resistance to almost any form of change, even beneficial change. For a strategist, this is truly paralyzing. It actively discourages innovation and adaptation.
And the last one in this group.
Self-serving bias. This is the very common tendency to attribute successes to internal factors, my brilliant strategy, while blaming failures on external factors, unpredictable market downturn, bad luck.
My genius. Their bad luck.
You got it. This completely short-circuits the learning process because the actual flaws in strategy or execution that led to the failure are never truly identified or corrected. You don't learn from mistakes if you don't own them.
Wow. These biases sound like fundamental vulnerabilities in our thinking, almost like built-in blind spots.
Yeah.
How can we possibly mitigate them? It seems like a huge challenge.
It is a formidable challenge, no doubt, but it's absolutely possible. Mitigation requires a combination of structured organizational processes and disciplined individual cognitive practices. It's not just about individual willpower.
The system itself.
Exactly. On the structural and process solution side, organizations can build powerful defenses. Techniques like devil's advocacy, assigning someone specifically to argue vigorously against a proposed plan force consideration of downsides. Dialectic reasoning, examining a plan and its counterplan in parallel, does something similar. Scenario planning, developing multiple plausible futures to test assumptions against, is also key.
Forces you out of one view.
Right. And using diverse interdepartmental teams also naturally breaks down groupthink and brings different perspectives. On the cognitive techniques for individuals side, you have to consciously apply cognitive reframing to deliberately challenge your own perspective. Make a deliberate effort to seek out diverse and contradictory viewpoints even, maybe especially, those that make you uncomfortable.
Lean into the discomfort.
Yes. A powerful technique to combat overconfidence is the pre-mortem. Before you launch, you imagine the project has already failed spectacularly a year down the line. Then you work backward as a team to determine why it failed. This shifts the psychological frame instantly from confirmation bias, this will work, to critical evaluation, what could go wrong.
That's clever. So if I'm understanding correctly, biases like anchoring and framing corrupt how we represent a problem.
Yes.
Overconfidence and self-serving bias distort our inference processes, our judgments.
Correct.
And confirmation bias filters what information we even allow into our knowledge base in the first place. It's really about protecting those specific cognitive functions.
That's a very insightful way to frame it. Yes, protecting the integrity of those core components.
Okay. So the exciting news here you mentioned earlier is that strategic thinking isn't just something you're born with, it's developable. How do we actually cultivate it?
Yes, that's the crucial takeaway. It is absolutely not an innate gift that only a select few possess. It is a complex, but ultimately developable capability. However, it requires a coherent, multi-level effort across individual development, leadership behavior, and the broader organizational ecosystem. You can't just focus on one part.
Let's start with the individual strategist. What attributes and disciplined practices can we cultivate in ourselves to get better at this?
Okay. Well, while general intelligence is certainly helpful, it's not sufficient on its own. Research shows a high degree of openness to experience characterized by intellectual curiosity, imagination, a preference for novelty is a significant predictor. It predisposes you to the creative, divergent thought necessary for strategy.
Being curious helps.
Massively. Accumulated experience, especially varied experience from different roles, industries, or even countries, is also a powerful catalyst. Turning around a failing operation or starting a new venture from scratch. These are particularly potent developmental experiences. They build that deep knowledge base and those nuanced schemata essential for high-quality inference.
Learning by doing, especially tough doing.
Exactly. And critically, self-awareness. understanding your own assumptions, your biases, your default viewpoints. This is the absolute foundation for critical thinking. You have to question your own thinking before you can truly question the problem effectively.
And what about discipline practices? Things individuals can actively do starting today.
Right. Leaders can actively hone their skills by making dedicated time for deep reflection away from the daily grind seriously. Even just 30 minutes scheduled a week can make a huge difference. Engage in continuous learning, reading widely about your industry, but also geopolitics, emerging technologies, history, things outside your immediate field. Practice perspective taking by actively trying to look at problems through the eyes of others, customers, competitors, employees. And actively invite feedback and challenge from a personal council of trusted advisors, people who won't just tell you what you want to hear to break through conformity.
That's really practical advice. But even the most skilled individual strategists will hit a wall if the organization doesn't support them, right? What about the organizational ecosystem?
Absolutely crucial. Organizational culture is arguably the most powerful factor here. A culture that truly fosters strategic thinking provides psychological safety. It encourages sensible risk-taking and experimentation, it values open dialogue and dissent, and it rewards creative efforts, even if they sometimes fail.
So failure has to be okay, to some extent.
Within reason, yes. Learning requires experimentation. Conversely, a risk-averse culture will simply stifle strategic thought. Consistent emphasis from the CEO and senior leadership modeling this behavior is absolutely critical. Organizational structure also plays a role. More organic, less formalized structures generally enhance information flow and the generation of new ideas. Interdepartmental teams break down those functional silos and help build a systems-level perspective.
Getting people talking across boundaries.
Yes. And finally, strong organizational competencies, like a robust market research function or deep customer understanding, provide the rich data and insights needed to ground strategies in reality, not just wishful thinking.
Are there any structured frameworks that can help organizations guide this development or at least facilitate strategic thinking more systematically?
Yes, several frameworks are designed for exactly that purpose. The WC Strategic Thinking Framework, that's the U.S. Army War College we mentioned, is a comprehensive curriculum. It aims to build self-awareness, cultural awareness, ethics, while explicitly teaching critical thinking, creative thinking, and systems thinking. Crucially, it models that iterative, divergent, convergent process we discussed, teaching how to apply these skills dynamically in practice. There's also the Strategic Magnifier Framework. This is more of a cognitive tool for analyzing emerging changes. It uses 3 analytical lenses to magnify a potential change driver like a new technology or regulation. It asks, how does it affect your core competency? How does it affect your core potential, your ability to create future competitive advantages? And how does it affect your current competitive advantage? This pushes you beyond just surface-level analysis to think about longer-term implications.
Looking deeper.
Exactly. And finally, catalytic planning frameworks like SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, PESTLE, political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental, and scenario planning. Now, these don't produce strategy on their own. That's a key mistake people make.
They're not the endpoint.
No, but they provide structured methods for environmental scanning and internal assessment. They are the raw data for strategic thinking. They can powerfully kickstart that divergence-convergence cycle by providing the inputs.
It really sounds like a truly holistic approach is required. A real collaboration between the individual, their leaders, and the organization itself.
It absolutely is. Strategic thinking requires a symbiotic relationship. An organization can have the best culture and processes, but if its people lack the core skills, it's ineffective. Conversely, a highly skilled individual strategist will be frustrated and ultimately stifled by a bureaucratic, risk-averse culture that doesn't allow them to use those skills. Any serious attempt to improve strategic thinking must be a holistic strategy in itself, developing individual capabilities, fostering leadership behaviors that model curiosity and intellectual humility, and designing an organizational ecosystem that actively encourages and rewards this difficult but essential work.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've taken a really deep dive into strategic thinking today. We've moved from its precise definition to the inner workings of the mind, the essential skills it demands, the dynamic models of reasoning, those tricky cognitive barriers that threaten it, and finally a multi-level framework for cultivating it.
What emerges, I think, is a unified understanding. Strategic thinking is that generative and synthetic cognitive mode required to navigate novel, uncertain, and ambiguous environments. It's powered by that dynamic interplay between a rich, organized knowledge base, flexible problem representation, and powerful inference processes like reasoning by analogy.
And it relies on that toolkit of synergistic skills. Systems thinking to see the whole interconnected picture, creative cognition to generate truly novel solutions, cognitive reframing to shift perspective when you're stuck, and cognitive reflection as that crucial meta skill to question your intuition and deploy the right tool at the right time.
Right.
And as we've explored, this sophisticated mental machinery is vulnerable to common biases like anchoring, overconfidence, and confirmation bias. These must be actively overcome through disciplined individual practice and a truly supportive organizational ecosystem.
The ultimate conclusion, really, is that strategic thinking is truly the architecture of competitive advantage. It is the human capacity to envision and actively create a desired future, rather than simply reacting to the present and its relentless problems. And while it is undoubtedly a demanding and multifaceted capability, it is not some innate gift. It is a developable skill that can be understood, taught, practiced, and cultivated at every level of an organization.
So for you, facing a future that seems characterized by accelerating change and profound uncertainty, the commitment to building this cognitive capability isn't just an option for improvement, is it? It is, quite simply, an imperative for survival and sustained success. What will you do differently to cultivate your strategic mind after this deep dive?